Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today's episode of Legal Tea is a cautionary tale where we talk about real-life cases, real-life people, real-life clients. They are things me or my office have actually worked on. Now, for today's episode, we're going to be talking more about a general topic that seems to be coming up more and more frequently. The topic we're going to be talking about is estate planning involving a beneficiary with some sort of addiction. As many know, addictions come in many different sizes and types too. It could be an alcohol addiction, a drug addiction, an opioid addiction, a gambling addiction. Regardless, for today, any addiction, at issue is really part of this episode, and it's specifically applicable to how we handle beneficiaries with addiction issues when it's time to #do your estate plan. And I haven't mentioned our estate plan or our hashtag in a while, have I? So I figured I should drop it. So since this is a Cautionary Tales episode after all, I think to explain the takeaways that I want you to gain from this episode, I will share 3 real-life stories of where addiction and estate planning have come head-to-head. For the first story, let's name the client Sandy. So about 10 years ago, Sandy came to our office to have us help her with estate planning. Now, the very first meeting with our office for estate planning is with an attorney, and I often jokingly tell clients it's kind of like a blind date. That meeting is to get to know each other, and if we like each other well enough, to spend more time together, which will involve getting to know each other even more. It really is a lot like dating, huh? When Sandy came into that meeting, she had shared that she was no longer married. Actually, I think she was widowed, I believe, if I remember correctly. And she had one child, a son who was in his early 40s, and let's name that son Tony. Sandy further shared that Tony had battled an alcohol addiction for a better part of 10 years. Through Tony's battle, Sandy would constantly support him, mentally, emotionally, and financially. Throughout the last 10 years, Tony was not able to hold a steady job, hold a steady place to live, and not really even hold a steady balance in his checking account. As Sandy shared these things with us, our job as the estate planning attorney is to be sort of like a sponge and collect as much information as possible to create the best plan for Sandy and eventually Tony down the road. It was quite clear that if something happened to Sandy, Tony was likely not in a position to hold any type of role like executor or trustee. But even in addition to that, Tony was also likely not going to be able to receive his inheritance and be financially savvy with it. Or even what if it, as a possibly worst case scenario, fueled his addiction. Through Sandy's estate planning process, we created a super great plan to eventually, at Sandy's passing, support Tony. At Sandy's passing, Sandy designated her accountant to serve as her executor and trustee. A great idea. That accountant will be an unbiased professional to serve in these roles. Sandy's estate plan at her passing creates what is called a separate share trust, which is a trust to support and benefit Tony, but instead of Tony managing his own inheritance, the accountant stays as the manager or the trustee of Tony's trust as well. Sandy had thought long and hard about how she wanted Tony to inherit specifically. Did she want a monthly stipend, an annual distribution, a distribution based on age? We went back and forth quite a bit with her. Now, ultimately, she decided to have the trust spit out a specific amount per month to Tony. And if the accountant, or the trustee, suspected any evidence of his alcohol addiction, the accountant could request Tony to submit to an alcohol screening, and if Tony failed the screening, he would sacrifice a year of the monthly distributions. And before the monthly distributions could restart after the years passed, he'd have to submit to another screening. If he passed, monthly distributions would start back up. But if he failed, there would be no distributions for 6 additional months, and at which the process would start again. Screening, if pass, monthly distributions restart. If fail, 6 more months of no monthly distributions. To me, this plan is set up beautifully, absolutely beautiful. Sandy in my office worked really, really hard on putting together a great estate plan. I think Sandy's story shows that if you or someone you know has someone near and dear to them with any type of addiction, and it's time for estate planning, you just really have to be sure to carefully think about, who is going where, like who is in charge, what I mean by that, and how does that person inherit? If you want to be able to leave them something, but do so in a way that will support them and not hurt them, work with your estate planning attorney to come up with how to do just that. It's possible, just with a little extra thinking and a little extra work on your part and my part. For the second story, let's name this client Cliff and Carol. For many years, many years ago, my office helped Cliff and Carol create an estate plan. Through the estate planning process, we learned that Cliff and Carol had 2 children, specifically 2 girls, and one of the girls was doing fine and dandy. She was a hardworking professional, married, had a couple kiddos. There were no issues with daughter number one. Daughter number 2, we cautiously planned around. Just like Sandy in our last story, Cliff and Carol ended up sharing with the attorney that daughter number 2 had a severe alcohol addiction. Something bad would happen and number 2 would get sober, usually through the support of rehab and Cliff and Carol, of course. And for this reason, as like a just in case sort of thing, Cliff and Carol had created their estate plan to have daughter number 2 inherit through a trust. That way, if she slipped, daughter number 1 would be there to manage daughter number 2's inheritance. Fast forward a number of years, and we hear from Cliff and Carol again. They wanted to come in for a general review of things and possibly to make some changes as well. At the meeting, they shared that daughter number 2 was finally done with the battle. She'd been sober for years at that point and actively worked to ensure it stayed that way. So after weighing the pros and cons and discussing how to set up things or how to kind of change things maybe, they ultimately decided they no longer wanted to burden daughter number 1, and since daughter number 2 had been sober for a number of years, they wanted to remove the piece about daughter number 2 inheriting through a trust. Therefore, at Cliff and Carol's passing, daughter number 2 would receive her inheritance totally free of trust and totally no strings attached. She would have full control. And I'm sure you know where this story is going. Fast forward a few additional years, Cliff passed away, and then Carol passed away shortly thereafter. Their plan was left, as we just talked about, 50-50 between daughter number 1 and daughter number 2, and they would both get their inheritance what is called outright, meaning they'd get it the no strings attached sort of way. Well, unfortunately and tragically, and whatever additional words, we could probably use, daughter number 2 had slipped and had started abusing alcohol again. In the first meeting following her parents' passing, the only one that came to that meeting was daughter number 1. And she asked the question, is there anything we can do to get my sister's inheritance back into the trust to protect her from herself? I explained that, there may be some solutions, but they would cost a little bit and someone would have to take the lead. and someone take the lead in terms of, sort of taking the baton and trying to carry this forward. As much as daughter number 1 adored her sister as a human, as a sister, as a friend, she simply could not commit herself to that level of time, energy, and emotions. So she did not want to push forward with any of my proposed solutions. She let daughter number 2's inheritance just go to her outright. To this day, anytime I think about Cliff and Carol and their daughters, I wonder what happened to daughter number 2's inheritance. Did she save it? Did she blow it? Did something happen to her? And I'll occasionally think of them, and it's very sad to me to say this out loud, but I'll Google her name and obituary to see if something has happened. Last time I checked, I didn't find anything. But, that's sort of where this story ends, sadly, is, I don't really know how it ends, but kind of we were left with the pieces that we were left. So finally, story number 3 is much shorter, I promise, much shorter, and let's call this client Tom. So Tom's story is just a touch different, but a good thing to know and learn from Tom's story. When we met with Tom, he chose, for whatever reason, to not share with us about his son, who had a pretty severe gambling addiction. I'm sure he had his reasons, for Tom not sharing. He either thought it wasn't pertinent, maybe he was embarrassed, maybe he didn't want to air his dirty laundry to the lawyer, who knows. Nonetheless, he didn't tell us about his son. I'll never understand why people don't share. There's so many things we can do, so many tools in our tool belt that can and will support unique circumstances like an addiction. So at Tom's passing, his son received a portion of Tom's estate. It wasn't until we were working with Tom's other child, a daughter, when we heard about her brother who spent many evenings and weekends at the casino and doing online betting. Had Tom shared that with us, we could have, like Sandy and Cliff and Carol, we could have had his inheritance go into a trust to be managed and monitored by someone else to protect Tom from himself. We could have had it distribute, X amount per month or something, rather than plop a chunk of change on the guy and watch him gift it to a local casino. Because that's likely exactly what happened with Tom and his son. From these 3 stories, I hope it's clear that sometimes careful planning is needed. Anytime I have clients bring up these type of situations, I think they're a little embarrassed or sad, emotional about it, and they're of course not exactly thrilled to share, right? I guess Tom didn't share in my last story at all. But what I can promise you, what I can tell you is that most families and clients have an elephant in the room type of thing to talk about. And actually, when clients are like, no, Jenny, all my kids, all my beneficiaries are fine and dandy, I'm actually a little skeptical, only because it's fairly infrequent that there is truly nothing we need to thoroughly discuss and carefully plan around. Whether it involves an addiction, whether it involves an in-law we don't care about, whether it involves a pending divorce, a lawsuit, or even creditor problems, 99.9% of the time, there are estate planning options to support those people. But estate planning attorneys are not mind readers, my friends. You have to share those concerns with us so that we can appropriately plan for them. And we'd love to help you help them. That's what we're here for. Alrighty, let's wrap this episode up and shift to a sneak peek of next week. We are back to the current events, current trends topic, where we talk about something I've seen or run across, maybe on the news or social media, that I think would be interesting to chat about on here. During next week's episode, we're going to be talking about a story out of New Jersey that I stumbled upon on Twitter that is about a gentleman who started a company to help nursing home residents get qualified for Medicaid. Well, New Jersey legislators are coming down on these companies. And as I've just discussed before on here, probably for good reasons. There's more and more states that are coming down on these kind of companies. So we're going to talk about that next Tuesday, Legal Tea listeners. So until then, take care and be well.